The pandemic fractured the way public schools operate.
Schools decide to reopen to students in a few weeks. There are going to be some changes. Health precautions will be a priority. That means masks.
Do we send our kids back in the middle of a pandemic, or do we try to teach them in front of a screen at the kitchen table?
5 years later, mask mandates and remote learning are long gone. But many public schools still aren't what they once were. That's because fewer students are filling the classrooms.
We have seen a decline of about 1 million students nationwide in the public schools.
With enrollment falling, principals, superintendents, and school boards are now trying to figure out, where'd all our kids go?
Just this kind of head scratcher. Why is this happening? This is a really hard problem for school boards because they have to think like economists and demographers and fortune tellers.
And for some places, this drop can lead to some dire conditions down the line.
And that is what happens in rural areas over time. If you lose enough students and you have a lot of people moving from rural areas to urban areas, you're going to end up with this kind of slow decay of public institutions, including what many people's favorite public institution, their local school.
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This is The Broadside, where we tell stories from our home at the crossroads of the South. This week, the puzzle behind public school enrollment drain and how fewer kids in the classroom can rattle an entire community.
I'm Liz Schlemmer. I'm an education reporter at WUNC, North Carolina Public Radio.
As a reporter, Liz spends plenty of time sifting through tedious data about education. It can be a grind, but recently she came across some numbers on public schools in North Carolina that really caught her attention.
So I was just looking at fall enrollment data from traditional public schools across the state and saw, oh yeah, wow, this has really gone down, and it's gone down over a 5-year period.
Almost every public school district in the state, 101 out of 115, has fewer students now. Liz says public school enrollment has been slowly declining for a while, decades. But numbers really took a nosedive during the pandemic.
And because of that, it's really pinching school districts' budgets. Their funding is based on how many students they have. Their state, local, and federal funding, all based on per student.
So when a school district sees less students enroll, it puts much more pressure on their bottom line.
Because, yeah, some things that they need are per student, but some things that they need, it's like part of the whole system. Like, you've already got a school building. Well, you got to pay for the heat for it. So when you have this slow decline of students, it just really affects the overall economy, the efficiency of the funding that they get, and how they can spread it around for everyone.
To see how public schools are adjusting to this big drop in enrollment, Liz visited a district in North Carolina that, until recently, was expecting to grow.
So Newton-Conover City Schools, it's in Catawba County. It's about an hour northwest of Charlotte. So really kind of beyond suburban, a little bit more of a rural area. This is a school district that only has one traditional high school.
Oh, wow.
They're building a brand new high school right now. They started planning it like 5 years ago, right? It takes a while to plan, finance, construct a school.
This portion here is already under roof, so...
The superintendent, I got to hang out with him all day long. His name is Aaron Gabriel.
This is where people will walk in to an athletic event, so we're actually walking into the courtyard right now.
But this school that was partially meant to address overcrowding in the county is now not likely to be crowded.
Liz says Newton-Conover City Schools has seen an 11% drop in enrollment since 2019. That's one of the steepest declines in the state.
Still scratching my head. because that's the one thing that I want to impact, but I can't control it.
Nevertheless, the wheels of growth are already in motion. Even as the district's enrollment numbers go down, new walls are still going up.
First, we went to this construction site, this new high school that's being built, and he's very excited about it, feeling like maybe this will attract people there. He said, if you build it, they will come.
We're here, and we got room. Come on.
We left that site. We went to an elementary school where he was planning to have a staff meeting with teachers to talk about potential staffing cuts for next year. And he said, so far, I haven't had to cut any positions that work directly one-on-one with students every day, but he has had to cut some central office positions. Then, interestingly, when we were at that elementary school, this was very memorable for me, we bumped into someone who works in a central office. We ran into Tammy Brown. She has been picking up the slack as he has had to cut other central office jobs. And also, I thought what was memorable to me was that they have also known each other their entire lives.
She was in first grade when I was in kindergarten, so we've known each other that
forever.
long. But Tammy's the one that took her roles that she had before, K-8, federal programs, ESL, et cetera, and then took on chief academic.
Yes.
Tammy can talk.
How many jobs?
50.
Yeah, about that.
If she stands here long enough, I'll give her another one.
That really hit home for me. I'm from rural Indiana, and a lot of my family members worked at our local public school district, and a lot of my friends' parents did. And that's what a lot of rural parts of North Carolina look like, too, where the school is a major employer for the entire community. And everyone knows all the people who work at the school because they all went to school there.
Yeah. Okay. So fewer students means less funding for public schools like this one in Newton Conover. And less funding can trickle down into staff cuts, which can hit a place hard when the school system is a big employer in the area. That's the problem here. But what's causing all of this? My first thought is private schools. Is competition from school choice what's really going on here?
So maybe less than you would expect. This particular school district doesn't have any charter schools that it's competing with. There are a couple private schools in the county, and there's multiple school districts within the county that students can move between if they want. So there is a little bit of some competition, but not a lot. So Superintendent Gabriel was saying, all this is going on, and I don't know why. I get these enrollment projections from the state every year, and I don't really know what's behind them. So I went to talk to the guy who writes those projections for all the school districts across the state.
Yeah, I'm Nathan Dollar. I am Director of Carolina Demography at the Carolina Population Center at UNC Chapel Hill.
What Dollar told me is when school boards start getting really nervous about their fall enrollment, they call him.
They're wanting to understand what's happening. Why are we losing so many students?
Nathan Dollar said, what I do is I look at the three most likely suspects. It is the birth rate, migration patterns of people moving into the state, and then market share. And by market share, he's talking school choice, private schools, homeschools.
Let's talk about those one by one. Tell me about the birth rate. How does that play into this?
I mean, that's the first part, right? It's like if fewer children are born, then 5 years later, fewer children show up in kindergarten.
So fertility is on the decline everywhere. So in the United States, fell below replacement level fertility during the Great Recession, and we've been consistently below replacement fertility ever since.
So the U.S. is below replacement level, meaning if a woman has an average of 2.1 births, children will replace the parents and you'll have a stable population. The birth rate in the U.S. is more like 1.6. North Carolina is tracking pretty well with the trends of the U.S. birth rate.
Okay. And what about migration?
So migration in North Carolina is the one thing that is keeping our population growing.
Right, because all I hear is about how more people are moving to North Carolina.
Yeah, but they're moving to particular places, right? So the Triangle, counties outside Raleigh, they are booming. Counties immediately outside of Charlotte, they are booming. The coast is booming. But there are some rural parts of the state that are losing, and there are a lot of counties that are really more or less holding steady. So yes, people are moving here, but it really depends on where you are.
And the last thing you mentioned is market share. Can you break that down and explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so there's a few different school options that families have, right? They can send their kid to their local traditional public school system, or homeschooling really went up during the pandemic. The other thing in North Carolina is that we've got school voucher expansion. So this is a state-funded grant to families that they can use to pay for private school tuition. Third is charter schools. Charter schools have been growing in the state since 2010. There used to be a cap on how many there could be. So that's just grown very steadily over the past couple decades.
So how are these three factors influencing school board decisions? Like thinking about Newton Conover, what about something like consolidating schools? Is that something that they're considering?
Oh, gosh, yeah. When I was talking to Superintendent Gabriel, he was like, I know you're going to ask me about consolidation, but small school districts are really afraid of that, concerned of that, and especially around identity. No one likes to lose the school that they went to. And he also said it's about the identity of this is Newton Conover. It's two little towns down the road from each other. And he said there used to be a sign on the highway that would say Newton-Conover, exit this way. And he talks about how that dash is important to them because they used to have a lot more things that were Newton-Conover. And right now that's changed and it's really just the school district. That dash matters to us. We have an identity.
Coming up, how falling public school enrollment is afflicting communities across the country.
There's a lot going on right now. Mounting economic inequality, threats to democracy, environmental disaster, the sour stench of chaos in the air. I'm Brooke Gladstone, host of WNYC's On the Media. Want to understand the reasons and the meanings of the narratives that led us here, and maybe how to head them off at the pass? That's On the Media's specialty. Take a listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Having a school close for lack of enrollment, for under-enrollment, is just an incredibly wrenching event for a community.
Alec MacGillis is a reporter for ProPublica, covering public education post-pandemic.
Many cities and towns, the schools really are the hubs. Going beyond just the school day, 9 to 3 p.m., they really are, in a lot of neighborhoods, especially challenged, struggling neighborhoods, they really are kind of fulcrums of the community.
Last year, Alec reported on a wave of recent public school closings across the country and what it signals for public education as a whole.
That doesn't mean that it's not necessary. We should make that very clear, that when numbers drop really low at a given school, it does not really make sense often to keep it open. School budgets are strapped now, and it's simply not efficient to be heating and staffing a building that is dramatically under-enrolled. And so you understand why districts are feeling that they have to take the step of closing a bunch of under-enrolled schools now, but it remains that it is an incredibly wrenching event for the community.
When a district shuts down a school, Alex says the closure is likely to take a heavier toll on some students over others.
Yes. So historically, even pre-pandemic, when districts have had to close schools because of enrollment declines, there's research showing that those closures tend to fall especially hard on Black and brown populations in those cities. Put bluntly, it seems as if districts often end up closing, are more likely to close schools that are heavily majority Black and Hispanic than schools that are less so. This problem has been exacerbated in these last few years with these post-pandemic closures because the enrollment declines have been especially dramatic in cities where the schools were closed especially long during the pandemic. And places that schools were closed especially long during the pandemic were overwhelmingly, disproportionately majority Black and Hispanic schools.
To zoom in on one of those cases, you focused on School 10 in Rochester, New York, as a prime example of the impact of that closing a school can have, right? Tell us about School 10. What grades did it teach? What was the makeup of the school? What was that community like?
School 10 is a school in this working middle class section of Rochester, a really quite lovely section of town. And the school's been around for decades. It's a very historic building built in 1916. Its latest iteration was as a K-6 school that had about 300 students. And it was a school that was really beloved in the neighborhood. The school had, like many schools in Rochester, its test scores were not great. It had been marked as underachieving by the state regulators, but in recent years it had been improving, and it had actually just undergone a major renovation a couple years ago, a really, really nice renovation. And there was just a real sense that things were headed on the right track at the school, and so they were very startled when they found out that the school was not going to be closed entirely because it had just been renovated, but rather that it was going to be instead given over to a public Montessori charter school, a school that had more white middle-class parents, whereas School 10 was almost entirely Black and Latino.
Big picture, what does a school closing do to a child's education? Like, how does that impact the stability and the success of their education?
There is a lot of research showing that kids who've gone through school closures and reassignments do end up over the long term being negatively affected. Again, that does not mean that in some cases it might work out better for a given student. You know, if there's a school that has truly been struggling and that school ends up being closed and students are reassigned to other schools that are better led with more resources, more class offerings, after school opportunities, because it's a bigger school, there are plenty of cases where that might actually work out better for a given student. But overall, research from cities like Chicago that have experienced widespread school closures has found that there is, on average, some negative effect.
What impact does it have on the community? Like, how do the parents and the families in these districts respond once a school is closed?
In some cities, it's such as, again, Chicago, there's been massive uproar when these mass closures are proposed, and it becomes a real kind of political rallying point.
The battle over school reform in Chicago has parents and teachers in that city outraged. Yesterday, school board officials approved shutting down 50 schools, the most schools closed for any district in the
In Chicago was one reason. It became a major challenge for then Mayor Rahm Emanuel when he proposed this to close dozens of schools in Chicago, and this was pre-pandemic. It really is seen in a lot of cities as a real blow to the community. You think of places where entire generations will have been going to a certain school where there's just real attachment, real emotional investment. And then just to have that building then simply standing vacant, unused, it becomes, really almost has the effect of, like an abandoned factory or plant.
Yeah, this image of this empty building that's standing there almost like a ghost town sort of feeling is so evocative. But of course, in the case of School 10, that isn't what happened. They ended up using the building for a different school. But what's the legacy of a place like School 10? How does it continue to influence its former students and the community even after it's closed?
Well, I went to a couple of very moving sort of end of year events at the school. They always have end of year kind of, graduation awards type things. But this year it was much more charged and emotional, and they were trying to put the best face on it. And one very eloquent administrator was up there saying that, that the legacy of the school will live on because you're going to be dispersed all around the city, and other schools will recognize that this is a School 10 child because they're, especially motivated or caring or compassionate, and that was the way they were trying to cast it. But the fact is that it was just really quite sad then to see the moment after the bell rang for the last afternoon, and they did this little tradition that they do every year where the school buses that are picking the kids up to take them home do a couple loops around the very nice kind of park square the school sits on. And it just went around and around, and the teachers were waving and crying, just openly crying and playing music as the kids drove off for the last time, because in most cases they weren't, they just weren't going to see these kids again.
The image of these school buses full of kids circling the block has stuck with me since I talked to Alec. What should have been a happy victory lap at the end of the school year turned into one last loop before an emotional goodbye. It's a scene that serves as a cautionary tale for hundreds of struggling public school districts across the country, including Newton Conover outside of Charlotte.
It can be a real body blow to a community, and having to note that it's still often going to be necessary. It's why it's so important to keep enrollment numbers up in public school districts so that it doesn't become something that has to be seriously considered.
If you'd like to read Alec MacGillis' story about school closings, check out our show notes. You can also find a link to Liz Schlemmer's story on public school enrollment in North Carolina. Charlie Shelton Ormond is our producer. Jared Walker is our editor. Our executive producer is Wilson Sayre. The Broadside is a production of WUNC North Carolina Public Radio and is part of the NPR network. If you have feedback or a story idea, you can email us at broadside@WUNC.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or share it with a friend. I'm Anissa Khalifa. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.